Welcome back. It's the Big Blue Banter, New York Giants football podcast. I'm Dan Schneier, joined as always by my co-host Nick Filato. Today we're here to recap a wild Black Monday for the New York Giants that started off to seem very benevolent when Brian Daboll came out in his postseason presser and basically said, "Look, everything you expect is going to happen," in the sense that we're bringing back Wink Martindale, who obviously, in my mind at least, coached a very good defense this year. I know people throw out the number of they were 27th in defense, and I'm like, what are you using? Scoring or using yards? That's wow. Using yards to talk about how a defense performed to me is almost as bad as it gets because the objective is scoring. And Wink Martindale's defense was always about holding teams in the red zone, holding teams on third down, turning the ball over, at least at the end of his tenure, and not giving yards is a very overrated stat if you're looking at defenses.
They were 26th in scoring though, too.
Okay, that's not great. But
No.
I mean, part of that is also when you throw a million pick sixes and you're throwing a million turnovers and you're
Of course.
Daniel Jones had 6 interceptions in his starts, and they fumble, they're putting him in horrible position. I think the eye test showed that wasn't the 26th best defense, but I mean, that's for anyone to decide. But point being, we were still happy to hear Wink was going to be back. Kafka was going to be back. They're moving on from Bobby Johnson, which we're going to talk about on a future podcast. And they already have an interview in with an offensive line coach. We'll talk about that as well. That'll be coming out shortly after this. So it's future, but it's not too future from here, not too far future. And then obviously Thomas McGahee, the special teams coordinator, was also let go. Something I think these are things that we maybe expected as fans, Nick, but weren't guarantees by any means and were necessary by a lot of means. So everything felt good. And then out of nowhere, we got the news in the middle of the day that first we got the news that Brian Daboll or the Giants fired 2 of Wink Martindale's favorite assistants and his right-hand man, in a sense, almost in some ways, kind of not forcing his hand, but putting him in a weird spot. And then we get the news that Wink Martindale resigns, which I was thinking about this in my head when I saw this yesterday, Nick. I don't know. And I was running around yesterday, busy in the city doing a few other things, but I don't know the last time I remember a Giants coach resigning, Nick. I was thinking about that word resign and to make that decision on his own, which, by the way, one final thing on this, it gives the Giants his right. So it's if he, for say, talks up with Nick Sirianni this offseason and wants to join the Eagles, the Giants could actually block that if they want to. And I don't know what's going to happen on that front.
There are many layers. Yeah. To this, Dan. There are many layers to this entire situation. All of that was deliberate in my mind. Having an 8:30 in the morning press conference with Joe. When do they ever do that? They don't do that.
True. Often. It's never 8:30 in the morning. You're so
Brian
right.
Brian Daboll wanted to put it out there to the New York media, to the Giants fans, that we have every intention of retaining Wink Martindale. But this goes back months, the tension between Wink Martindale and Brian Daboll. And it's something that was detailed by, in my opinion, in your opinion, I want to say, one of the more plugged in NFL reporters in Jay Glazer, who works for Fox Sports. He said there was tension. Now, I don't know who his source is, but it definitely seems like it was deliberate that Wink Martindale wanted it to be known that there was tension. I don't know if Wink Martindale was the source. I don't know if it was one of the Wilkins, but we know the Wilkins are tied to Wink Martindale. We know that because when Wink Martindale interviewed with Brian Daboll, he said something to the effect of, if you guys don't go with me, you should hire Drew Wilkins. And you know that him and Kevin Wilkins go back to their time in Baltimore together. But I think we should go through the timeline of the tension between Brian Daboll and Wink Martindale when we, as people who cover the New York Giants fans, started kind of realizing, I don't know if these two are really getting along.
Yeah, you can let's let it rip, Nick. You run us through this timeline.
We should start on November 5th. November 5th was the game where the New York Giants went to Las Vegas. Let's put ourselves back into that timeline. We were in the mindset of, hey, maybe the Giants can go on a run here. You could beat the Raiders, right? They just fired their coaching staff. It was Antonio Pierce's first game as an interim coach. Aiden O'Connell was starting. Jimmy Garoppolo got benched. And what ended up happening, unfortunately, the Giants got their asses kicked. It was a 30-6 beatdown, which prompted defensive captain Xavier McKinney to quote this. He said this after the game. Honestly, it sucks. I don't know, man. I don't really have many words. I think that from a leadership standpoint, I don't think they've done, saying the coaching staff, a great job of letting the leaders lead and listening to leaders and the captains. And in typical Brian Daboll fashion, the next time he spoke to the media, he downplayed the shit out of this. Now, a couple days later, when the coordinators actually went up to the podium and they started talking with the media, and that was on November 9th. Remember, the beatdown by the Raiders was on November 5th. Martindale went on like a 6+ minute, maybe it was even 8-minute tirade about the Xavier McKinney situation. And some of the quotes from that one was, really took a while for him to point out exactly what it was. But I think you grow from that. And I just told him that it is something, and it hurts the locker room. It hurts the defensive room when you say something like that. And he said a lot of things to that effect. And then at the end, Wink Martindale ended up downplaying it as well. And it also seemed like that McKinney complaint, it wasn't unanimous. It was an isolated complaint. It didn't seem like a lot of the other defensive players shared those thoughts, or at least they were not vocal about that. So a lot of us on Giants Twitter and everything, we blamed Xavier McKinney for those comments. It was more like, hey man, like, you're a leader on this team, you're going out. But there's some weird tension in the defensive room. I think it's very safe to say that. And then fast forward a couple weeks, November 26th, Jay Glazer comes out and said Daboll and Wink's relationship was in a bad place. And he said, when I talk to people inside of the organization, they're saying the tension between these two, you could feel it. And they were talking about maybe a mutual parting of the ways after the season, and even potentially something in the final few weeks of the regular season, whereas Wink Martindale could possibly get fired. So that fired is already out there at this point, right? Like, you're starting to think like, oh man, he might get fired at the end of the year. I thought it was more of a Brian Daboll issue. That's the way I initially took it. I was like, he's a very disagreeable type of person. Maybe that's why. And you started hearing some talk about Mike Kafka was also possibly not going to be there. And it was just like, man, something's really wrong with Brian Daboll. And that's also compounded by the fact that the New York Giants really sucked this season and everything was kind of going downhill. And we saw some curious mistakes throughout the season by Brian Daboll too, right? Like, he was not, as I would say, sharp on the football field. We all kind of pointed our fingers towards Brian Daboll, but I think it's safe to ask, at least, Dan, was some of this deliberate, right? Because Daboll just kept shutting all this down, as any head coach should do. He was making jokes about how basically him and Wink Martindale are fat. Like, oh yeah, we were just arguing about who's getting the next pizza or who's getting the next donut, right? And then on December 17th, Wink Martindale, he didn't necessarily deny the tension, because this is the first time I think he was talking to the media since the Jay Glazer report. He said, we're fine. It's the same thing as it was last year. It was just different because we were winning more games, which suggests to me there was probably tension this entire time.
Yeah.
And you do look at Daboll's personality. That's a fiery guy. He has a high standard for his coaches, gets in his coaches' asses. Not necessarily the case for the players. He is a little bit more of a player coach. Like, he'll get in his players' asses. I don't know, man. I think the meshing of these two personalities definitely wasn't something that was going to work if Wink Martindale is somebody who is a little bit more of a reserved, down-to-earth type of coach, a veteran coach, probably doesn't like having a coach get in his ass as much as possible. Some of these quotes were deliberate. I think Wink Martindale wanted to get fired so he could control his future, so he can collect his entire contract. And then the Giants got ahead of that by putting out an early press conference before there was a resignation or before they were going to fire him. And then they fired the Wilkins brothers, and that prompted fire from Wink Martindale, who was like, yo, what the hell? Like, those are my guys. Now I'm going to resign, and now the Giants control my future. I think this is a pretty damn interesting story.
It is an interesting story, and it's a weird development, something we haven't really experienced as fans or even covering the team. I would say my initial reaction, Nick, was this is embarrassing a little bit on the Giants front to have a coach resign after a season where, one, you could tell, I don't care what anyone really says about the 26 in scoring, because again, I feel like half of that has to do with how bad the offense was and how many times they turned the ball over and put them in bad positions, but whatever is what it, and just, they didn't, in my opinion, they haven't really given the defense a lot of talent. They've given them like 2 first rounders, not many seconds, not many thirds. They finally signed someone, but like there were holes all over this defense talent wise, thanks to Dave, and just not a lot of assets to spend. But again, like, in my opinion, the defense played well at the end of the season. They are the reason they won those DeVito games. 100%. They had 13 turnovers in 3 games. They are 100% the reason they won those DeVito games. And in a lot of ways, I thought they were the reason they won that Eagles game at the end of the game. Tyrod had some nice drives, some nice explosive throws. They scored 24 points. They didn't really score much after that. They still won the football game. And ultimately, Nick, I thought the players loved playing for for Wink. I don't know if that's necessarily the case based on Xavier McKinney's comment, but I see pictures after the game of Bobby Okereke and Wink Martindale and Micah McFadden embracing, taking pictures. I see how hard they played for them. I see what Kayvon said about Wink Martindale. I see what Dexter Lawrence, how he played under Wink Martindale, how Wink Martindale figured out the best place to put Dex is on the nose. And I don't care who the fuck is the defensive coordinator that comes in next. If we start to see Dex come off that nose, something's effed up, and you effed up, and you got to figure that out. And you got to adjust your defensive system to fit around Dexter Lawrence being over the nose for a lot of these.
It's not that simple, though.
I know it's not that simple.
If you bring in an even front defensive,
right, but then you're effing up. In my mind, it's over.
You were put him at the one tech, which gives the guard better angle to block him. Exactly.
Right. And I just don't want that. Like, they need to bring in an even front guy. I mean, I'm sorry, not front guy. And that's going to be a big thing for me. And they could do whatever they want. They could bring in Frazier. I know Frazier's an even front guy, but it's like, and whatever, you can go with the status quo. If Daboll knows him, he worked in Buffalo, and he has put together a great defense. And he's a smart guy. So I'll just adjust to it and I'll be fine with it. But I give Wink credit for figuring that out and for unlocking Dexter Lawrence. And I know Dexter Lawrence loves playing for Wink because Dexter Lawrence was not on the career trajectory, Nick, that he was on now before Wink Martindale got there. And that's that's an undeniable fact right there. But, you know, again, he wasn't a perfect defensive coordinator, right, Nick? Like, the 26 in scoring is real. There were issues all over the place. Quarterbacks who can process fast gave him trouble. It's not like we were watching a perfect DC, but I felt like the players love playing for them. So my initial reaction was, this is bad luck for the Giants. But as you unpack it the way you did, Nick, I start to think about it like, you know, maybe this isn't as much on Brian Daboll, because we do have a guy in Wink Martindale who had issues in the past with John Harbaugh, forced him out of Baltimore and to some extent. Now, as
mutual parting of the ways, you can look at the past of Wink Martindale and be like, there's at least a foundation or a framework where something somewhat similar happened in the past. Not entirely similar, but I think the Giants organization just got ahead of this. And by forcing him to resign, now you don't have to pay him your whole contract, and you control where he goes. He can't go in division. He can't go to Philadelphia, who desperately needs a defensive coordinator, because, again, he is a good defensive coordinator. Not the best, but I do think he is a good defensive coordinator.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Not the best, but still a good defensive coordinator. Still brings something every week unique to the game plan. Like, we've gone all over that, and we can go over that another time.
And we should touch on some of that too, yeah.
And we could. So, like, but that's my initial reaction. Then as I unpack it again, like, you know, bad stuff, bad blood at the end of that Baltimore relationship. And just like generally speaking, I do think Wink Martindale, this is not a bad thing, by the way. I think some of the best athletes in the history of football have this, but I do think Wink Martindale and Brian Daboll, that's obvious, both have big egos. Like, this is not like, you know what I mean? Like, it's like, I've seen coaches come in and out of the Giants throughout the last decade and a half. Some of them have egos, that all of them have egos. They're coaches in the NFL, but some of them have big egos, and some of them have medium egos, and some of them have egos so small, at least to the public, that you can't even hear them or see them and how they talk. Both of these people, to me, have egos, and I think that's pretty clear. Two massive egos clashing. Like, just look at Mike Kafka, for example. Like, look at the difference between the situation now, Nick, between Brian Daboll and Mike Kafka and Brian Daboll and Wink Martindale. We saw what happened with Brian Daboll and Wink Martindale. What's happening with Brian Daboll and Mike Kafka? Kafka's probably going to be back. But what unit has looked a lot better and has a lot less question marks on tape and on the field over the last 2 years? It's not the offense. It's the defense. And yes, personnel plays a big part. But still, like, it's clear that, like, in my opinion, at least, Mike Kafka defers at times to Brian Daboll and a lot of what Brian Daboll wants to do. And I think that's part of being an assistant coach. But I'm not so sure Wink Martindale had that in him, Nick. I don't think he had that in him in Baltimore, and I don't think he had that in him here. And maybe it worked last year because, like Wink said, they won football games. But this year, they weren't winning games. And when now you have two big egos clashing, I want my way, you want your way. Don't find compromise. And it seems like we're dealing with the political landscape of the United States right now.
It does kind of seem like we're dealing with some sort of political landscape, right? Like, there's some jabbing back and forth between Martindale and the New York Giants. And I think that's obvious at this point. I look at Wink Martindale's defense and the defensive structure. Look, loading the line of scrimmage, 7 guys on the line of scrimmage, manipulating protection, sending free rushers, all that stuff. Absolutely love it. I think he's one of the best in the NFL at doing that, but you need to have a good offense to maximize that defense. And this offense was not great. You need to put the defense in a situation where they're pinning their ears back in the second half, on second and long, on third downs, so they can get their exotic blitz and their exotic pressures out at the opposing quarterback. That's what you need to maximize Wink Martindale. This season, he did not get that. The Giants offense was pathetic, right? And I want to make that clear because this defense wasn't great. They were tied first, though, in turnovers, which is crazy, right? They had 31 turnovers this season, which was tied with the Baltimore Ravens for number one. Last year, they only had 6 interceptions. So the turnovers came full force back, but they were still susceptible to some explosive plays. They were still susceptible to bending and not breaking in the first half, but then breaking in the second half. I do think a lot of that does lie at the feet of Brian Daboll. Look, I don't think this is as easy as it being black and white, where it's just either Brian Daboll's fault or it's Wink Martindale's fault. It's a combination of both because, as you said, Dan, very well, these are two coaches in the NFL who have huge egos. So when you have huge egos, there's going to be some disagreements. I am a Giants fan. You are a Giants fan. If you're listening to this podcast, you're more than likely a Giants fan. And as much as I respect Wink Martindale and I appreciate Wink Martindale, I'm still glad that the New York Giants ended up coming ahead of Wink Martindale in this situation by controlling where he is going to go. Because I don't want Wink Martindale to go to Philadelphia. So at the end of the day, I think that's where I guess my quote unquote happiness lies if I'm going to look at it through that type of lens. But yeah, so I don't think it's as simple as one guy's at fault. I'm sure they both share some fault in this situation.
If Wink Martindale went to the Eagles, which I guess now is unlikely to happen, though I don't think it's like impossible. The Giants can block it, but I think they probably would, but you never know on that front. Like it's a weird, tricky situation. But I'm happy because I don't want to see Wink Martindale scheming against Daniel Jones after knowing every single thing about Daniel Jones's mental game. Like I do not want to see that.
Well, we've seen that
on tape.
We've seen that.
We've seen it in training camp last August, but
we saw it back in 2020 too.
Oh, we did see it back in 2020. You're right. What was? Oh, I don't even remember that game for Jones in 2020. How was?
Oh yeah, Matt Parrott gave up 3 sacks in a row.
Parrott? Oh yeah. I don't want to see that. And as far as Wink goes, like I don't think he's like the perfect defensive coordinator, Nick. I think there were big flaws throughout. I think a fair question that a lot of our listeners asked me, Nick, and I'm sure they asked you this as well in your DMs, which was, why does it seem like anytime we get one of these super fast processing quarterbacks that face off against the Giants, Wink Martindale's basically like helpless in a sense, his system, and we're just not producing at all really within his system. And I'd say there's been times he's actually done well against fast processing quarterbacks like Aaron Rodgers last year, but I also feel like Rodgers is not as fast processing as he maybe once was. And some of the really good quarterbacks the Giants have faced from a processing standpoint, he hasn't done so great again. But then again, like Stafford, he did okay against Stafford at times. He gave some big plays, but he also had some good moments against Stafford, who I consider one of the faster processing quarterbacks left in the NFL. So I would say that, but I would say what I'm going to miss most, Nick, is one, just having a different game plan every single week as a defensive coordinator based on the quarterback, based on your personnel, based on the game plan for that specific opponent and how they're playing that week. And Wink Martindale was never afraid to do different things on defense, to have different, like, I've seen so many coordinators come through the Giants, Tim Lewis, Perry Fuel, guys who are just sitting back basically in zone the entire time, playing off coverage, you not really doing much, even to an extent, Patrick Graham, who we like. There were times he disguised coverages, Nick, but a lot of what he did was pretty similar. And I even saw, I was reading some stuff this year, Nick, because he might be in the mix as a defensive coordinator candidate potentially. And not like a top priority, but I've heard his name mentioned. And I read something from the Raiders this year, and they basically said what I thought they would say, which is what the Giants said in 2020 under Patrick Graham, Nick, which was once we started to figure out this defense and get on the same page as a secondary, everything clicked. And it's like one of those defenses where you're going to run the same stuff every week, and you just got to wait for your defenders to get on the same page. But what's going to happen, Nick, is, and what concerns me is, if the Giants go back to a new system, and if it's an even front, like you said, and now Dexter Lawrence isn't even utilized the way that we've learned would maximize and unlock him, because sometimes coordinators come in, they run their system, and that's it, and you adjust to it. I just think it's going to take some time, man, for them to adjust. And then it's like, what happens? It's Brian Daboll year 3. Our defense is insanely slow to start the season. We have Daniel Jones at quarterback.
Yeah.
What happens next? It just puts the Giants' current regime with Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll in a really, really tricky spot. That's the one main reason I wanted Wink back, so the defense doesn't get off to the slow start where there's communication breakdowns and they don't really feel comfortable in the system. And you even saw that with what was the system this year that is playing? Who's the defense playing really well right now? And they were talking about how hard it was at the beginning of the year. I'm trying to think of the team. There's a team right now that is just playing great on defense at this stage of the year. And I'll come back to that, Nick. But the point being is, the Giants are going to have to go into a new system this year on defense. And that does concern me. That's concern number one for me.
And if the team does struggle next year, and the defense isn't meshing, whether this is Brian Daboll's fault or Wink Martindale, however you feel about the situation, the fault is going to be blamed on Brian Daboll
And
and
Shane.
Shane. But to a certain extent, you look at it, look, whoever is at fault here, Brian Daboll is the head coach. It's your job to keep the coaching staff together. And I think if you want to look at it from a macro point of view like that, there is some truth to that, right? Like, you are the head coach. You got to find a way to kind of mend it and keep it all together. He tried with comments through the season. It didn't end up working out, but yeah, if they suck next year on defense and Bobby Okereke doesn't look as good and Dexter Lawrence doesn't look as good and the players that we saw thrive within Wink Martindale's scheme start to look like they've regressed, everyone's going to blame Brian Daboll. And another aspect of this, what's up?
It's like, so that's an interesting dilemma to have as a human being in your head, right? It's like, can you fault Daboll for that or can you not? I want, like, at that point, it's like, I don't know, Nick, how big the egos are between Brian Daboll and Wink to know if I can.
It's not the point.
Fault. Yeah,
that's the point. You're going to fault them if the team sucks. You're going to be like, well, last year they were great in Brian Daboll's system. Now they suck. Where's Dexter Lawrence? Where's Bobby Okereke? None of that even matters, bro.
Right.
If it's rational or not, it doesn't matter, right?
Sure.
And I also think it's interesting because other than the Xavier McKinney comments, we really haven't heard any Giants say anything negative.
That's the thing. I feel like these players loved playing for Wink besides that one Xavier comment.
If you're a defensive guy, and Wink Martindale, by all accounts, had basically full reign on the defense, Brian Daboll really wasn't meddling that much. He was more focusing on the team in general, right? And the offense, helping with Mike Kafka. But if you're a defensive guy and maybe you don't love Brian Daboll and your guy, Wink Martindale, gets shipped out of town, how is that going to make you feel moving forward?
Yeah.
So that's another element of this that you got to look at, that it could be a deleterious effect on the New York Giants moving forward. If some of those defensive players harbor any resentment towards Brian Daboll for what happened to Wink Martindale and Drew Wilkins. Because I know Kayvon Thibodeau was high on a guy like Drew Wilkins.
Kayvon Thibodeau was very high on him and on Wink Martindale. I heard him speak with Carl Banks about Wink Martindale as well. And deleterious is a new Nick Filato vocabulary. This guy's the most insane vocabulary in the history of the world. I'm a journalism major, and I can't even come up with a fourth of the words he comes up with. But one thing that I was going to touch on there, the big thing is, and this happens to a lot of NFL teams, Nick, the Giants aren't going to be alone in this, but part of the NFL is you draft to help your coordinators and you scout for your team's system on defense. And the Giants have drafted a lot of players in the last 2 draft classes for Wink Martindale's system. They come in and bring a Leslie Frazier system in or a Patrick Graham system in. That's totally really the opposite of a Wink Martindale system. Where does that leave these players that were specifically drafted to fit this system? And that's also the part that, like, not leads me to believe they're in trouble, because this happens to a lot of NFL teams, Nick, but it leads me to believe they are probably in line for a little bit of a regression period on defense. Not by the sense that, like, the next DC can't be better than Wink. That could easily happen. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is it's going to take time to learn that system. It's going to take time to unlearn the habits of the previous system. And some of these guys are going to be better fits for the previous system and not as good fits for the new system. And this is just part of life in the NFL when you move on from a DC. It's why it's great to be able to retain and keep it rolling back and forth if you're a good team. Obviously, like the Chiefs with Steve Spagnuolo, for example, they've been able to really rip that thing through. And now in a year where their offense is actually kind of horrible, the Chiefs, they're still a playoff team because Steve Spag's defense is playing awesome. So, you know, it's just another one of my concerns. Did we draft a lot of players to fit Wink's system? And that's just part of life.
What's going on, Big Blue Banter listeners? I'm excited for the football season for several reasons. And one of those reasons is Prize Picks, which is North America's largest independently owned daily fantasy sports platform. And it's so simple to use. Instead of battling thousands of other players, including professionals, sharks, and people who are going to exploit you, you pick more than or less than on 2 to 6 player stat projections, and you just watch the winnings roll in. It's very simple to play and gives you a little extra skin. I've set my picks in less than 60 seconds. There are so many stats to choose from, and the withdrawals of funds are easy and quick. Dan and I will be adding a segment to our show before every game where we pick our favorite stats, more or less yards or touchdowns, what have you, and we'll be discussing why from a scheme, matchup, and game theory perspective. I love their promotions and how easy their interface is to operate at Prize Picks. I may select more on tackles for a loss from Bobby Okereke or Kayvon Thibodeau next game. They also do other sports as well. It's a really cool experience. Please join Dan and I in the fun of Prize Picks. Go to prizepicks.com/banter and use code BANTER for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, go to prizepicks.com/banter and use code BANTER for a first deposit match up to $100. You will not regret it. Make Little Caesars, the official pizza sponsor of the NFL, part of your game day. There are few things better in the world than kicking back, watching some football, and biting into some delicious Little Caesars pizza. Order online during our Pizza pregame, 1 hour before and 3 hours after NFL kickoffs, plus all day on Sunday. And get ready for some football and fun. Choose your favorite Little Caesars pizza or pick the toppings you crave. Old World pepperoni, extra cheese, Italian sausage, olives, onions, pineapple if you're into that. Put it on half the pie, the entire pie. There are so many other options that I don't have time to name. Slap that on a round crust, a thin crust, a stuffed crust, a Detroit-style deep dish. Either way, you win. And speaking of winning, everyone scores with convenient delivery or our in-store pizza portal pickup. So grab some friends and enjoy a few slices during the game. I think some of these players, they can mesh well with other systems, but take a guy like Leslie Frazier, because his name's getting thrown out there. I think he blitzed at a 19.8% rate in 2022 as last year as the Bills defensive coordinator, whereas Wink Martindale blitzes at a 40% rate. So with his defensive structure, and I know he's blitzed at a higher rate than that in the past, but generally speaking, with his defensive structure, you're relying on your front four to get after the quarterback.
Yes.
I don't think the Giants have that right now outside of Dexter Lawrence. So,
and is Dexter Lawrence even going to be that same kind of pass rusher if he's not in the same system? Like,
I think he can wreak havoc out of one tech, and you can do some creative things when
so. Like, yeah.
I mean, he was good in Patrick Graham's system. It's just
what were you going to say? Those creative things where
Oh, so like I know that they're going to demand double teams in the passing situations. The center and the guard are both going after Dexter Lawrence, which is going to allow whoever is opposite of him, whatever side of the one tech he's on, to have a one-on-one matchup against that tackle unless the tight end is in there. So you kind of can at least figure out what kind of protection the opposing offense is going to run based on, that he's going to demand a double team as a one technique. That could give Kayvon Thibodeau some advantageous matchups, but you don't really have another edge rusher if it's going to be like a 4 down.
I know.
End. You don't have that.
I know.
Right now.
That's
Kayvon Thibodeau can
I don't
want
Azeez Ojulari as an end on an even front.
No, it's
Kayvon
weird.
can do it, but
yeah, Kayvon I think can do it.
I almost feel like an even front might be even better for Kayvon personally. We'll see what happens there, but I definitely don't feel that way with Azeez.
I'm gonna miss just watching Wink Martindale's defense.
Yeah, it's much more fun to watch. We watch Patrick Graham defense. We watch Wink Martindale defense. It's night and day as far as the fun. It's going to be a lot less fun, in my opinion, to watch the Giants defense and on tape. And then I assume for you guys on broadcast, but you guys can decide that. Obviously, if they're playing well, it's going to be better to watch whoever the hell the coordinator is.
Wink Martindale didn't get enough credit for being as adaptive as he is. We've said that so many times in this podcast, but in his bones, in his philosophy, that identity, it was, I'm going to get after you, bro. Like, I am going to bet the house on this, baby. Whereas Patrick Graham is much more reserved, man. Patrick Graham was much more, hey, I'll let you check down. We're going to rally and we're going to tackle. We're going to play 3 deep. We're going to play 4 deep. And that's what we're going to do, man. Coverage, not as much. Whereas Wink, it was like, I'm going to get you. And I loved watching the safeties fly off. I love the A-gap plug. And the week 18 game against Philadelphia was probably the best representation of what I'm talking about, because they got after Jalen Hurts like crazy. I don't have the blitz percentage.
I felt like they did a lot of that interesting stuff for Stafford too. I thought that was a really good game plan for Staff too.
They did.
It was more. It was like against Philly. You're right. It was more like every play. It felt really good. But yeah, you're right.
Against Stafford, it was interesting too. We brought this up on the All 22 podcast because the Rams, they run a lot of wide zone, a lot of stretch zone. So the Giants just tried to do the 5-0 front. They tried to just build the wall of having the tight front, and then the edge rushers spill everything to the outside. Have, unfortunately, Cordell Flott come down and run support, which isn't always the best thing, but have those have those apex defenders and those cornerbacks and the safeties flow to the ball and then make the tackles. And they were in base a lot against the Rams, or their base against Rams was a 3-3-5, whereas that's not always the case. But yeah, I'm going to miss watching Wink Martindale's system. I think he's a good coordinator. I also have the statistics here though on Wink Martindale, because it wasn't always great, right? Like I said, last year, the Giants were dead last in interceptions. They had only 6 interceptions. Well, they weren't dead last. They were dead, but they were next to the Raiders, who also only had 6 interceptions. But they did force a lot of fumbles. But when you look at the system this season, Dan, they weren't as efficient, because that's what the defense relied on last year. They were efficient on third down, and they were very efficient in the red zone. And if you go through the 2022 defense, points against, they were 17th. Yards allowed, they were 25th. Rushing yards allowed, they were 27th. A lot of that is a product of just terrible linebacker play. Their blitz rate was first. Pressure rate was 6th. Sacks, they were 13th. They had 41 sacks. And then turnovers, they were 25th. They had 19 turnovers. This season, points against, 26th. Yards allowed, 27th. Rushing yards allowed, actually worse, 29th, which was interesting. Blitz rate, 2nd. Pressure rate, 21st. That is not good, by the way. Sacks, 28th. They only had 34 sacks. Many of them were from Kayvon Thibodeau. And then turnovers, they were tied for first with Baltimore, like I said earlier, 31. That's an interesting dichotomy between these two stats, because there are a lot of similarities there. But then you look at the sacks, they were higher last year, lower this year, but the turnovers, which we all know can be somewhat fluky, specifically interceptions, there were a lot more this year than there were last year.
Yeah, and they came in flurries too this year.
Yeah.
And it's going to be interesting to see where they transition as far as coordinator goes and who they start to get into. And we're going to briefly touch on some coordinator candidates now, and also talk a little bit about the decision to move on from Wilkins and what's going on at the, outside linebacker position / edge position for the Giants. And then, just as a heads up, as we work through these next few, 24, 48, 72 hours in the next couple weeks, we're going to get into, it'll probably be even shorter than that, the timeline for the Giants. We're going to get into deep dives on the defensive coordinator candidates, who ultimately they hire a defensive coordinator, if anyone is brought in for interviews, things of that nature. Also, as we're going to go through all the positions, offensive line coach, the Giants need a new one. They're already interviewing one guy who we're going to talk about on the next pod, special teams coordinator, things of that nature. And just want to give you a heads up on that. But Nick, before we get into some early defensive coordinator candidates and people who have caught your attention, maybe what did you make of just everything that's gone down, the decision to fire Wilkins, and just the production of the edge group for the Giants?
Yeah, so Kayvon Thibodeau had his like 5 or 6 game stretch where it really started looking like he was scratching the surface of being that 5th pick. And then they played the Eagles, and it was not good against Jordan Mailata. He was shut down the entire game in that first Eagles matchup, and he didn't really finish the season all that strong. And I got to say, man, against the run, it was a real issue, specifically against the Eagles. But if you look at Kayvon Thibodeau, and I think Brett Coleman tweeted this, Kayvon Thibodeau was like 90th in pass rush win rate. Now, I don't know if you really want to look into that, but it's still an objective statistic, right? Azeez Ojulari was 91st. You had no other edges. So I want to give Drew Wilkins a little bit of leeway there. Like, you didn't have a great edge group. The Giants were relying on guys like Timon Fox last year and O'Shane Jimenez, who they did not want on the team. Jihad Ward, who is a Wink Martindale guy, mind you, was a primary edge rusher on this team. That's not a great situation. It's not. And I think Jihad Ward blocked me, and I have no idea why, because I tried looking for him and I couldn't find him. So
I think he blocked like everyone on Giants Twitter. I don't think I ever got blocked by Jihad Ward, but
I didn't like a couple months ago, and I checked today because I heard somebody say that he put like a farewell message up, because him, Carter Coughlin, Cam Brown, a bunch of these defensive and special teams players are kind of saying like, hey, I'm not going to be back. It's a little bit weird. Is that an indictment on Daboll? I don't know. Am I reading into it too much? Who knows? But that's not a great edge group for Wilkins, and Azeez Ojulari has spent much of his career injured. But 90th and 91st in pass rush win rate is not exactly excellent. And if we're going to really throw Bobby Johnson under the bus for being objectively terrible, which we'll talk about a lot on the next podcast as well, maybe we should look at a guy like Drew Wilkins and be like, why haven't the young players you've received developed? And I think at least that conversation, it might not be totally fair because of all the things I listed about a minute ago, but I think that conversation should be had.
Yeah, it's fair to be had. And obviously the Giants had that conversation when they made the decision to move on. And we're gonna that's a big talking point because I think you're right. I was very excited and hyped about Kayvon Thibodeau's development at a midpoint of this season, but it obviously wasn't the end stretch of the season that we wanted from Kayvon. And same thing. I mean, on the Aziz front, it's like at this point, I don't know what our expectation could be going into for 2024 for him. Like, I obviously he's made my list a bunch of times, your list as well, Nick, as sleeper, breakout, potential these past few off
Yeah.
seasons. It just hasn't happened at all, or even really shown signs to me of being close to happening. So there needs to be maybe a decision to, I guess, change how you develop those guys. But I don't know, Nick. I think a lot of it is just these individual players too, as well. Like Aziz's injury history, and then Kayvon currently, at least in my mind, just maybe necessarily not developing at the end of the season the way we wanted him to. But I am curious to see what direction they go there as well, and like how they how they view the need, like what they believe is the need to fix there. Like, is the players, is development, is the coaching?
So Kayvon Thibodeau had 520 pass rushing reps in 2023. He had 466 in 2022. In 2022, he had 45 pressures. In 2023, he had 44. It's just those sacks spiked dramatically, which that's the end goal right there. You want those sacks to spike dramatically. But he had so many less hits this year. He had 12 in 2022. He had 4 in 2023. So to me, that says, hey, he's at least finishing his sacks. So he doesn't need the hits. He's finishing his sacks. But at the end of the day, he's not necessarily winning more like we need him to. Now he's just a little bit quicker. That's a development. That's a step in the right direction that we should not take away from Kayvon Thibodeau. But I think it's safe to say we still want to see a little bit more from the pass rushing and a decent amount more as a run defender. And I'm hoping that that's something the next defensive coordinator and outside linebacker coach can unlock, because this is still, a 22-year-old kid. I think he still has so much upside. I think he's wildly talented. So I'm hoping that we get that.
I think that's all fair. And I think that's pretty obvious, at least to me, Nick, on just the eye test. Like, Kayvon Thibodeau definitely does a good job of closing, but is he winning a lot of reps? Are we currently seeing him just like beat left tackles often or right tackles often? That's probably not as much as we would like to see. And so hopefully I'm curious. I think I personally don't think this is the best system for Kayvon Thibodeau's skill set. I never did. I think he did a lot of good job. Like he worked his ass off and okay, you want me to drop in coverage? I'll drop in coverage and I'll do my job. But I think there are systems that are better fits for him personally. And I'm hoping that the next system will be one of those. On Aziz, I'm just hoping for the best there, but I don't have too much,
I'm just hoping for health, man. For health.
Yeah, I'm hoping for health, and then I'm hoping, at that point, it's not just health. Like I need production too from him, but yeah.
Aziz, I think production will come with Aziz Ojulari. I think the Giants need an edge rusher. I think we're not talking
like
enough.
That was just you've been saying this, Nick, for like the last 16 months, I feel like, and like you've been driving home the importance of it. I was hoping Aziz would maybe give them a little bit of a, leeway, I guess, and time, but no, the dire need is here, and you don't really find him in free agency unless you go like the Clowney route. But Clowney wants to sign with contender. Like those guys don't want to sign with the Giants with where they're at, the 1 year type, like you can get them cheap. So like basically they have to draft edge, and it just becomes another massive need for them edge. And it really is a massive need at this point because of where we are at with Aziz Ojulari. And that's the main reason I think it went from this is a need. And you were right that it was always a big need. Now it's like up there with all the big ones, the O-line, the quarterback, the ones that really make a difference. And so we'll see where it goes on that front. And I know there are a few edge prospects who actually might even be in the mix and considered a blue chip guy for the Giants, depending on how they evaluate them at 6. I think that'd probably be a stretch. Latu, the edge from UCLA, has the injury history, but definitely has crazy pass rush upside. Jared Verse from Florida State and Dallas Turner from Bama, all guys who the Giants might consider in that range. I don't think they'd go for the kid from Illinois, Newton. He's more of an interior guy, but first round, second round, it's in the mix now, Nick. And let's wrap up here by talking a little bit defensive coordinator, some early guys in the mix. I'll let you start with any intriguing names. I have one that comes straight to the top of my mind, so I'll let you go first.
Yeah, I wonder who the one that comes straight to your mind. So the person that I would consider would be Antonio Pierce. We have no idea if he's going to get that head coaching job. I'd imagine he has to get it with the job that he did, but I thought Bisaccia would get it with the job that he did after John Gruden got canned. So we don't have no idea what Mark Davis is going to do out there in Las Vegas, but I'm very interested in Antonio Pierce. I'm also interested, and I have no idea how qualified they are to do this, but if they are interested in this, Jerome Henderson and Andre Patterson at least being considered as DC. So I'm interested in that. Leslie Frazier, look, I think it should be explored. I don't love it. I don't love the zone defense, even front, but if that's I have to dive into it much more, the statistics. I don't want to really say that I hate it, but off the cuff, it's not something that really entices me. And then I'll let you actually I'll say the last guy too, whose name's been floated out there by a lot of people. I'm open to having Patrick Graham come back. Patrick Graham, similar to Wink Martindale, and we applauded Patrick Graham for this. I know he's not nearly as aggressive, but at least Patrick Graham, we saw him get the most out of Jabril Peppers, James Bradbury, you could say Adoree Jackson, Leonard Williams, and now not Dexter Lawrence, but Dexter Lawrence was a young player who I believed, watching the tape, was really coming along. Just wasn't necessarily maximized. And Blake Martinez, he got a lot out of. So he at least has somewhat of a track record of getting a lot out of talented football players who weren't utilized to that same potential and that same level in on their past teams. So I'm open to having Patrick Graham back.
I'm open to Graham as well. I look at the job he's done this year with the Raiders, and I look at that defense, and outside of Max Crosby, I don't see any talent whatsoever. And I see a lot of names that are like playing great ball. The middle linebacker they had, who they love, who's just like a journeyman guy who they turned into a great player there.
Perriman?
Yeah, no, not Perriman. The other guy, Spillane, the guy. The white,
Spillane. Yeah.
Or I don't even know if Spillane, the white dude. I'm thinking I might be thinking the wrong name, but
I think it is.
I think it might be. And just like the talent, they don't have any corner talent. They don't have any secondary. Like they just have no talent like on that defense. It feels like outside of Crosby, and they played unbelievable down the stretch, the Raiders, given the talent. So I'm open to Graham as well. Obviously, my top choice will be Jim Leonhard, the former Badgers defense coordinator, who went on to have another amazing stint at college level. We don't know. There's a few things about Leonhard. One, some people have said he wants to stay in the Midwest. I don't know if that's true. Two, he's always been a college coordinator. 3, Colorado's been heavily targeting him to bring in as their defensive coordinator. But I'll tell you the things I know about Jim Leonhard. The things I know is he's a Rex Ryan disciple. So he's going to bring a similar defense to the Wink Martindale defense. I've watched countless hours of his defense with Wisconsin. The best coordinator I've ever watched in my lifetime besides Steve Spagnuolo is him. That's the straight up fact. He got the most out of every single defense he ever ran. They're some of the most dominant defenses, despite Wisconsin consistently being 30, 35th, 34th in recruiting. Nick, they don't get 5 stars there. They don't get a lot of 4 stars. He takes guys like Andrew Van Ginkel, molds them from not UDFA, whatever is that equivalent at the college level, guys that are like walk-ons and 2 stars, Jack Sanborn. Now they're starters in the NFL. Van Ginkel's amazing. Jack Sanborn starts on the Bears and everybody loves him there. There's been one miss, Zach Baun, but basically everybody else hits. The kid who the Pittsburgh drafted this year, who I love the tape of, and I told you would be good, Nick Herbig, having an amazing year with Pittsburgh. All of a sudden, as a rookie, it's just these 4th rounders continue to just develop and play great at the NFL level.
He would have been great in Wink's system, too.
And he would have been great in Wink's system with Nick Herbig. And he was undersized, so nobody wanted to take him. And he lasted to day 3, and now he's already great. And it's like, this continues to happen. Leonhard had a track record developing these guys, mostly linebackers, but he had a track record. And I just know that his system wouldn't be that big of a departure from what Wink does. And we'd still be very aggressive. And his players love playing for him, but it would be a big jump for him to go from college to the NFL, obviously. And I don't know if he has any interest in that. Obviously, money talks, though. So I think that if the Giants made him a massive offer, he would say, okay, I don't have to live in the Midwest anymore. And okay, I can go ahead and, take that money and take this opportunity. But he will be the top of my list for sure for those reasons.
Is it safe to say you would be a full 3.9 inches if he's hired as the Giants defensive coordinator?
Nah, you're giving me way too much credit. Probably a full inch under. No, joke. Jesus. But yeah, Jim Leonhard, not just because he's Wisconsin. I think everyone around the program knows this, but I think people in the Big Ten who really study it, like the film guys I've seen in the Big Ten, the Iowa, from all the other schools, sing his praises for a reason.
Now, I have not studied the All-22 of Jim Leonhard, but I have watched Wisconsin football, and I would absolutely love that as well. Not just because it is similar to Wink Martindale. I do think he can get a lot out of this personnel. You're going to see Dexter Lawrence at the nose. You're going to see different types of even pressure packages from what we saw from Wink Martindale. There's a lot of it's a very exotic defense. And I think with the influx of the players that we're going to have come into this system to replace guys like Jihad Ward and players like that, with a new, fresh defensive coordinator who can relate to players because he was a former player, I would be all about that.
Yeah, former player Jim Leonard obviously worked with Wink and with Harbaugh, not Wink, but with Harbaugh in Baltimore. And one final guy I'll throw out there. It's not going to happen because I think his ego's too big, and he's only going to come back for a head coach job. But I can tell you, what I'm going to say, because I think if he was hired tomorrow, the Giants defense might be better than it was today already. And I think there would be the fastest transition. We won't have to deal with like the weeks 1 through 5 where we suck on defense. There's a million breakdowns. Oh God, it's awful. Rex Ryan. I don't.
Yeah,
is that how you thought I was going to go? I love Rex Ryan defenses. I just
James Betcher.
No, not Betcher. We can't go back. Did you see that from Wes Steinberg?
Yeah. But Steinberg's the best, bro. But what's it called? Yeah, I absolutely would support Rex Ryan. It's never going to happen.
Yeah, he's not coming back for DC. He's only coming back.
It's not even just that. I don't think John Mara would hire Rex Ryan, and I could be wrong.
Probably true.
Rex Ryan was the most bombastic, arrogant.
Yeah, you are right about that.
Head coach
work with Mara,
who constantly took shots at the Giants through the media. He was grabbing the front pages of like the New York Post and everything. That was his thing. Rex Ryan, very exciting. I don't think John Mara would be about that, and I don't think he would come back anyways. He's going to
not as DC. Yeah. All right, that's all we have for today on the Big Blue Banter podcast, wrapping up the Wink Martindale. Keep it locked and loaded, though, and stay tuned in your feeds, because coming shortly in your feed is going to be a recap of all the other news. Joe Shane's presser, Brian Daboll's comments in that presser, the other decisions, the coaches they fired, and an early interview for offensive line coach. So thanks again. Have a great rest of your week, and we'll talk to you soon.